to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Season 5 of Raising Teens. I'm your host, Collett Smart. I'm a psychologist, a teacher, and also a parent in the middle of raising my own teen and young adult children. I started this podcast because I know that many teens are struggling, and I wanted to create an online village of support for parents. I'm joined again this season by well-known experts on teen mental health and well-being. I have such hope for this generation of young people, so each episode is jam-packed with support so that you can get on with the job that you do best. That is, connecting with and loving your teen. Daniel Principe is a youth advocate and educator, and every week he is invited to engage with schools and communities all across Australia to help them to have the confronting conversations. Having heard the heartbreaking stories of thousands of young people across the country, he is determined to address the elephant in the room in order for us all to be part of creating the positive cultural change we all hope for. But first, he invites us to face ourselves and the culture that has shaped us. Please be advised that this episode talks about pornography and sexual violence. You may want to listen to this episode first before talking with your teens. Hello, Daniel. Welcome to Raising Teens.
Good morning. It's lovely to be with you.
So Daniel, I have been following your work for a while, and I wish for every boy in this country to have heard about you and heard you speak. I have 3 kids, as most of my listeners know, and 2 are boys. My youngest is still in high school, and I just think that boys need male role models who just really tell them something different to what a lot of their mainstream media, social media, movies, what all of that is telling them about sex and pornography and what it means to be a man. I know that you are not afraid to talk about things like pornography, body image, penis size, sexual assault, suicide, online predators. I know that you can do it in a really frank and very honest way. And in all my years with teenage boys, what I know and what I hear about in my work is that they want someone trusted to be open with them about these topics. And I am so thrilled that Australia has someone like you who is doing this work. So thank you for what you do.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you, Collett. Look, it's a privilege to do the work. It's a privilege to be entrusted by schools, communities, and parents to work with young men and young women. But obviously, primarily my audience is young men. And I guess I'm just trying to offer them the kind of honest conversations I wish I had as a teenager growing up around all of those topics. And yeah, for me, I kind of give them a forewarning before I start that my talk will be one of the most confronting talks that they may ever hear. But it's necessary, it's true, it's grounded in science, and it's anchored in all the stories that we've collated across the country, what we're hearing in schools from young men, young women, their parents, and those that care for them.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that on your social media. So, Daniel, first, before we jump into some of the big parts of the topic, tell me about your website, The Last of the Romans. What is that? Like, where does that even come from? What is the story behind that?
Sure. Look, I won't spend too much time on that, but yeah, Last of the Romans is an expression that historians gave to the person who died and kind of embodied the virtues of ancient Rome. So if they were the last person that died, that was kind of considered to be embodying, whether a man or a woman, those virtues. So things that, that transcend time, space, and culture that we say are good: self-control, love, patience, perseverance, courage, those sorts of things. And so, yeah, I love the name, but it carries a bit of meaning. And I guess for me, it's about legacy. It's about saying that, yeah, hopefully when I die, I get to hand that baton on and embody that and pass that on to other young men that want to run with that and embody those virtues.
Beautiful. Wow. So then that leads me to ask you, how did you get into this line of work? what was the catalyst for you when you just decided, I actually need to talk to boys, I need to be a mentor, I need to talk about some of these big issues? What happened for you?
Sure. I think like with everybody, it's a meeting of both perhaps their skills, gifts, interests, and their own story and the stories that they carry. And so for me, I'm a health professional by training. That was my undergraduate. My postgraduate studies are in media, PR, and social media. And I'm particularly interested in the impact of visual-based images on shaping beliefs, attitudes, and behavior. I worked in politics and health as an advisor for the last 6-7 years, and that was in positive behavior change, trying to address things from anxiety to opioid addiction to all sorts of mental health and other challenges that we're facing. So you look at how do we shape behavior in a positive light, and at the same time, my studies and my particular interest is looking at, well, what are the unhealthy messages that we receive from pop culture, and what you'll probably hear me talk a lot about is porn culture. Like, what are those messages? What are they saying about the reality of men, women, bodies, love, sex? And how can we critically examine them and choose something healthier and more life-giving for ourselves? So that's more of my studies, my professional background. And then, of course, like with everyone, you bring your own stories. So for me, I was exposed to pornography when I was 10 years of age by an older family friend. That was something that impacted me for 10 years, and it was a different time and space. It wasn't as readily available as what we face today, but it shapes you. It gives you a pornographic style of relating to the world, depending on how much you imbibe the messages of pornography. But also for me, I was bullied from the age of about 11 to 19 because I was a soft, sensitive kid, and I'm a soft, sensitive adult. So I was called all sorts of homosexual slurs, all sorts of really unkind expressions because I didn't conform to some vision of masculinity that I was apparently expected to live up to. And so from a very young age, I was conscious of the way that boys are conditioned by the culture, but then how they socialize one another, the shaming, the policing, the messaging that they then reinforce within the pack of how you are expected to be. And so whilst I didn't have the language for that, that stayed with me. And then over time, I guess I've built the kind of frameworks, the understanding to kind of see through that, to make sense of my own experience, and then hopefully dissect that, use my own journey to help other young people. And a huge catalyst is obviously my incredible colleague, Melinda Tankard-Reist. I met her 8 or 9 years ago, and her work, her journey, her kind of books and articles really helped me make sense of the experience of men and women in a hypersexualized world. And that was a catalyst to then saying, I want to do anything to help out in this space. I had no real visions to speak alongside her, but here we are. And I'm so grateful for her courage, her leadership, and this wonderful partnership that we've now formed working together in this space. And obviously so grateful for Collective Shout and the supporters that have rallied to make this possible, to allow me to do this work and have seen the need and supported us to partner in this space. So that's a bit of the story.
You might remember that last season I spoke with Melinda Tankard-Reist, who spoke about pornography and sexualization from a female perspective. Here, Daniel talks from a male perspective. As always, this topic isn't about shaming our boys. Rather, it's about looking at ways that we can support them in becoming healthy young men. Touching on something you said there, you spoke about being exposed around 10 years old. And whenever I speak in parenting seminars and I even raise the topic of porn, most recently I had a collective gasp, and actually an audible gasp from one mum when I actually said that young people are being exposed around 10 years old. And you just spoke about how it wasn't even as readily available when you were 10 as it is now. And so even in your own life, you kind of a picture of what we are seeing in boys, that it is not unusual for boys that age to be exposed to pornography.
That's right. And if it's not at home, and, parents can have wonderful intentions for their children, be really committed, great parents with good kids, but you're fighting against $1 billion industry that preys on children. Like that's the fundamental tragic reality that we have to confront as a society. And so, the average age is like 9 or 10 for boys. It's 12 or 13 for girls, usually exposed at school, on a school bus, at a friend's house, or accidentally because of curiosities, looking up innocent things. And so that is the landscape they're negotiating. We were recently at a school in Geraldton. We had a couple of mums who you could tell they're the committed mums. They've done absolutely everything to protect their children, and they weren't living with their head in the sand. They said, look, we knew we were going to have the porn talk with our kids. And these two separate mums said, but we just weren't thinking it was going to be at 7.
Whoa. Yes. And so I hear these stories all the time, but when parents talk to me, I'm reminded, and when you say it like that, I'm also reminded that we have to be prepared. I'm always saying to parents, if you say not my kid, then that actually means you're setting your child up for failure in a sense, because it will absolutely be your kid. And, it's not, Melinda always talks about, it's not if porn finds your children, it's when. And so we've got to be prepared. And so, Daniel, I know that you've just stepped off the plane again from flying around the country. And I've seen on social media that boys tend to come up and talk to you at the end of your talks. What are some of the biggest challenges that boys are facing at the moment? What are they saying to you?
So the most common thing that I hear from boys is they've never heard a porn critical message before. No one's given them the facts. No one's given them the opportunity to reflect and consider, to listen to the other stories, because I share stories from other young men, to say, do you resonate with this? Have you seen the impact? So they're kind of being exposed for the first time that there could be harms, and then they compare that to their own experiences. But then they want to know, well, where to from here? What can I do about it? They even want to know, like, what does a healthy relationship look like? How do I stand up to my friends? How do I not conform to the pressures around me? And those are the kind of questions that they're grappling with. For the ones that are engaged, the ones that really do have a response that's like, I want better for myself. I want better for all my relationships, not just romantic, and better for the world around me. So, a lot of the boys just want to talk about their experience. They want to be heard. They want to share when they were first exposed. I just had a group of Year 7 boys tell me about what they've been exposed to by bots and predators on Snapchat and TikTok. And once we uncorked that conversation, so many hands were going up, and I'm catching eyes with the staff in the room to be like, are you listening to this? Like, are you hearing these Year 7 boys talking about being dropped porn and requests for sex and sending nudes by bots or predators or who knows what in their Snapchat and TikTok feeds?
Yeah, wow. So how do we then engage our boys? We need to obviously confront these attitudes and their behaviors that don't serve them and their relationships and society. But how do you do it without boys feeling judged or shamed about what's going on?
Sure. Yeah, because I never want them to feel like, the whole man bashing, which, occasionally someone may say that, but it's very rare. The resounding message is like, you are here doing this because you are for boys. And I go out of my way to articulate that, time and time again. So the reality is, in my intent, like, this is how I try to achieve this. I squarely locate myself in this story by sharing honestly about my own journey, my own experiences, that I have made mistakes when it's come to sex, love, dating, relationships, and my aspirations for being a decent man who lives his values. I've failed on all of those fronts. And I share that with the boys, and that I'm not some angel sitting on a cloud immune to my own desires, my own attractions, that I'm negotiating a sexualized world with porn culture saturating every place I turn. And so I'm on the journey with them. I'm just grateful I didn't do it with a smartphone when I was going through puberty with raging hormones, which is then where I then take the conversation and say to the adults in the room, like, we don't know what it's like to go through puberty with a smartphone in our hands with all of the temptations and all of the distractions, all the bullying that goes with that. and the amount of self-restraint that you would need as a teenager with a smartphone is just extraordinary. So for me, it starts with my own acknowledgement and then an exercise in empathy to say like, wow, we have no idea what it's like for them negotiating all of those difficulties right now. And so what does it look like to help them see their cultural moment, to see the experiences that they're growing up in and recognize that it's actually pretty atypical of what the rest of the world has experienced, where they are learning about their bodies, about sex and sexuality through porn in ways that no other culture has ever experienced that. And they're learning about relationships and all sorts of things mediated through a screen like no other generation has faced before. So that's where we have to start by giving them an understanding of their culture, and for the adults then to, like I said, have empathy for them and try and step into their shoes.
And so rather than people thinking, I mean, you will be familiar with this commentary as I am, people going, well, that's just the way it is now. You know, everyone looks at porn, get over it, get over yourselves. What do you say, or how do you frame that to boys or to parents? And how do we safeguard them then in the world that they're in?
Sure. Well, yeah, it's just because something's normal doesn't mean it's healthy. So, or it's become normalized. And what I remind people is like porn hasn't existed up until recently, you know, like, and don't tell me, oh, like rock carvings or drawings on, you know, caves or kind of phallic statues. No, that's not porn. We're not talking about hardcore endless pornography of videos of real humans having sex with one another, usually in violent and degrading ways. So no, this phenomenon is new by every measure possible. And the research is very clear on the harms to people on both sides of the screen. And most people know this. Most people know that porn is having a negative effect on their own well-being, on their own body image, on their own relationships, on their own satisfaction. And the global research is clear on that it's not helping people have fulfilling sex lives. For young boys, you know, appealing to the dignity and humanity of other humans, especially women, doesn't resonate when I tell them about the realities of the porn industry. We talk about porn-induced erectile dysfunction, a phenomenon that was unheard of 6 years ago, but is unavoidable and needs to be confronted because it's the first time in human history we're seeing adolescent boys with erectile dysfunction. And I speak to them about how Gabe Dean, one of my mates now, featured in discussing that in Time magazine and Rolling Stone, and you can go to YouTube comments or Reddit, you know, forums where that conversation is happening.
Because there are some people who talk about pornography not being an issue for society, here is a snapshot of the research that I wrote about in chapter 13 in my book, They'll Be Okay. We know there are increased rates of exposure to pornography in young people, particularly in seeing pornographic websites when they did not intend to access them. We know that porn encourages underage sexual activity. It encourages young people to view casual sex without affection or relationship as the norm. Cynicism about love and perceptions of exaggerated sexual activity in society become normal. We see shaping in sexual behaviors through belief in the pornographic script. In other words, expectations of what is deemed appropriate sex. We see a willingness to try out what is shown in porn and engage in more casual sex. There is also an increase in sexual risk-taking, such as unsafe sexual practices and more sexual partners. There's a normalization of coercive, painful, and unsafe sex, and coercive sexual bullying, sexual aggression, and forced sex among young people who consume pornography. We are seeing a link between emotional and mental health issues and pornographic use, and addiction-related brain changes. We want to equip you with as much information as possible, so we've added some of those links to the research papers in our show notes. So if someone comes to your teen school and talks about porn not being an issue, we hope that this evidence will give you some of the information that you need to be informed about the topic.
Ultimately, if we're going to anchor it in the research, and it's why I put out a public service announcement on my social media semi-regularly, is don't date anyone who consumes pornography. And the Australian Institute of Family Studies makes a pretty compelling case why my PSA is warranted, which is that the more you consume pornography as a young man, the more likely you are to be sexually violent, to commit sexual assault, to believe rape myths, and to be a bystander if someone else is being assaulted. So that's from their 2017 report on pornography in young people and its impacts. And the frightening statistic in there, and it's obviously correlation. It's not that everybody who looks at porn will commit sexual assault, but it's correlation. It's looking at the relationships. But one of the frightening stats is it says that if you consume violent pornography, which, let's just be clear, is upwards of potentially 88% of pornography, the research says, with 97% of that violence directed to women. So it's almost an irrelevant qualifier to say violent pornography, but for the sake of representing this report faithfully, it says if you consume violent pornography as a young man, you're 6 times more likely to commit sexual assault. So if you're wanting to stay, sexually safe, irrespective of who you are, and if you have male partners, like that's probably something to consider, like people to avoid. And like I said, that's completely available online. That should have been front page news in 2017 when that came out, as again confirming that this is the biggest public health crisis our young people are facing, and they want to have the conversation. Yeah. I was at an event in Sydney recently with 3 combined schools, and when it came to the Q&A, and this isn't any disrespect to the other 2 speakers who were CEOs of their own organizations, 75% of the questions came through to me at the end of the day because they wanted to talk about these issues because it was really relevant to the landscape that they're negotiating.
In a previous episode, I mentioned Christine Ember's article in the Washington Post about consent and sexual ethics.
This excerpt comes from Christine Ember's article titled, "Consent is Not Enough. We Need a New Sexual Ethic." It reads, "In our post-sexual revolution culture, there seems to be a wide agreement among young people that sex is good and the more we have of it, the better. That assumption includes the idea that we don't need to be tied to a relationship or marriage, that our proclivities are personal, and that they are not to be judged by others, not even by participants. In this landscape, there is only one rule: get consent from your partner beforehand. But the outcome is a world in which young people are both liberated and miserable." She also writes, "Over the past several decades, our society has come to believe that consent, as a legal standard and a moral requirement, could somehow make our most unruly activity more manageable. But it was never going to be that easy."
I asked Daniel to talk to us about how he tackles the word consent with the boys. So since we've kind of made it effectively impossible for anything apart from non-consent to be wrong, we end up framing issues in that prevailing standard. So basically, for our listeners, if something goes wrong, then somehow the consent that someone gave wasn't the right kind of consent. So essentially, we're blaming the consentee. So Daniel, essentially, for you, the word consent, I know you think it leaves out so much, and it's kind of more a legal criterion than an ethical one. Unpack for me some of the things that I know you talk about when you talk to young people about that word consent.
Yeah, well, we could have a huge philosophical discussion on post-liberal societies and how we've reduced all ethics to choice. Therefore, do you choose this? Which, again, I think is a very shallow understanding of what makes something ethical or good or beautiful or right, et cetera, et cetera. So, of course, consent is a no-brainer. It's how our institutions understand what's a crime or not, what's within the law or not. But I think for young people growing up now and for all of us, well, we know that there's something more significant to sex. And irrespective of any worldview, any religious or philosophical or political experience you bring into understandings of sex and sexuality, there's something significant to that can't be denied because of what happens in our brains when we're engaging in sexual intimacy with someone else. And obviously, if heterosexual people are having sex, then it can lead to pregnancy and life. And that's just a biological fact that I have to remind students of human biology all the time. And so when it comes to sex, we have to ask ourselves, like, are there other considerations? Are there other things that we need to consider than purely consent? And I engage with some of my audience on my Instagram about this, because it was just an obvious no-brainer for everybody that, of course, consent. But yeah, it's like, are there questions around, well, do I want a relationship with this person? Does love and respect matter for me if I'm engaging in this? What are the expectations that we have? Am I doing this because I'm hoping for a relationship? Like, there's so many other conversations that are going on that I think are really important. Am I ready to have sex? What does sex mean for me? Do I view it as recreational? Is it significant? Is it sacred? Like, how do I view sex? There's so many other questions that I think we need to ask ourselves to reflect on, both as an individual and then together with this other person, that I think are really important for young people to engage with. And then to flip it when it comes to just purely understandings of consent. Like, I've never seen so many disempowered young women as I do over the last couple of years engaging with schools, where they feel they have to go along with everything. And most of them have had consent conversations, but if you're living in porn culture, that's pretty much conditioned you and told you need to go along, because young girls feel like they're prudes if they're not up for anything, if they're not interested in sex, if they don't go along with it. So why I reject consent as a very single-eyed view of this is because it doesn't factor in, well, where does grooming, and I mean both social and cultural grooming, where young women feel they have to go along with this, where does power dynamics fit in here? Where does trauma, fit in here? And social pressures, where I hear from young people where they all feel like the boys are being pressured to have sex, the girls are being pressured to have sex. So you've got all of this going on culturally, socially, structurally, and far more about sex and sexuality. And I'm like, well, can we speak about that? Can we look at some of those drivers that mean that, yes, technically these girls are consenting to sex because they feel they have to, but they're not enjoying it. It's not something that they're bringing desire to, which is also a consideration that gets left out. Is there desire present? Is there mutual desire? Do you actually want this? Not just have you consented to this, but do you desire this? Which is, I'm far more interested in that conversation around desire, because if desire is present, then you have consent.
Yeah.
But it's teaching people then to know, like, what do they desire? Has that been conditioned, or are you being groomed for that? Like, what is it that you actually want? Which is, I think, a really embodied experience, and it encourages young people and young women especially to ask themselves that, do I desire this?
And I think also the conversation around the good of the other. Sex isn't just something for yourself that you do on your own. And so consent is a really low bar, because whatever you're engaging in a sexual relationship, are you really thinking about the good of the other? And how do you know that you really are is a question to ask. So, Daniel, I secretly have you on this podcast because I really want my son's school to ask you to come and speak. So where can people find you?
That's fantastic. Well, through collectiveshout.org. So I'm so grateful to work with Collective Shout, and they can go to the Request a Speaker page, and I'd be more than happy to follow that up, have those conversations. And obviously for your listeners, always open to being invited. And it's not just schools. We work with chaplains, we work with psychologists, counselors, businesses, like any organization who's looking to have healthy conversations about not only adults, but how do we raise children in a sexualized world to form relationships built on respect and empathy.
Thank you, Daniel. So I always ask my listeners this at the end: why do you have hope for this generation? So you are in one of what would be regarded as one of the darkest topics, but I know that you are still such a hopeful person. I've heard you speak with hope. So tell my listeners why you still have hope.
Sure. Well, in this particular reality, why I have hope is because most young boys, as I said earlier, and most young women have not heard a porn critical message. So if I was having this conversation with you, Collett, and I'd said, yep, I've spoken to 90+% of the young people in this country. I've given them the facts, the stories, the opportunity, the resources to choose something healthier, and they've rejected it and they've chosen porn instead. Then I'd be, devastated. That'd be cause for despair. But most of my audiences, less than 1% have ever heard a porn critical message before. Most of them have never heard this. It plants seeds. It gives them an opportunity. And obviously, we've only just started scratching the surface as a society about the harms of pornography. So that's what keeps me hopeful. We just had, and I never thought I'd say this, but Billie Eilish gives me hope because she came out and condemned pornography about 6 months ago, unequivocally, on the Howard Stern show. Said it was a disgrace, said it had harmed her, groomed her. So we are seeing cultural pushback where mainstream media is now reporting on the harms of pornography, how it's shaping offenders, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a sense where it is now undeniable. Some of our biggest critics and some previously pro-porn people are now having to change their assessment publicly because the weight of evidence and the cultural stories just continue to mount. So we are seeing a shift. Young people haven't been given the opportunity to choose something that's far healthier and more respectful. And so we just need more people to be having this conversation because young people want to have these conversations.
This is an example of an encouraging story that Dan shared on his Facebook page recently.
This message comes from a young man after Dan had spoken at his school. Just wanted to thank you for all the advice you gave me and all my mates today. It was an eye-opening experience. I knew the way women are portrayed in media and society was really bad, but I didn't realize how mainstream it was. Makes me a bit worried about what the future holds, but also motivates me to help the boys at school and around town to really break that misogynistic mentality that things like porn and really mainstream companies have created. And I think what you're doing with this is really awesome and a very important topic that deserves a lot more attention. Your talk today also inspired me to get outside more, be more active, and really work for that dopamine instead of getting that free hit online. Thanks again, Dan. You're a really cool person.
And that's what gives me hope. I hear from young men every single week who are quitting pornography and choosing something better for their lives.
This tells us that many teen boys are wanting to take a stand and make a difference. It highlights how they really want adults to talk with them frankly and openly about these issues. There are many aspects of the teen experience that are universal. There's some things that every teen in every generation has gone through. But access to pornography at this level is something that no generation has had to deal with before. If you would like to book Daniel to speak at your school or to follow his work, you can find him at lastoftheRomans.org. You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode via email or my Facebook page or via raisingteens.au. Or you can go to the Hope 1032 podcast page. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode, and in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.